Hi Year 10, welcome to week 4 of the Romeo and Juliet lessons. This week the key scenes are all from the end of the play. Here is your quick quiz to start you off, and as usual the answers are in the notes section of this PowerPoint. Okay, so Juliet loves and has married Romeo, but Juliet has also been promised to Paris by her father, and Romeo has killed Juliet's cousin Tybalt in a brawl, and because of that Romeo has been banished by the prince. So at the moment things are all a bit of a mess, and for Juliet particularly, she's going to have to think of a way out of it. And that brings us to Act 4, Scene 1. Juliet arrives at the Friars and she's met by Paris, who is busy discussing their wedding plans. They have a kind of quick conversation in which Juliet is quite rude and quite dismissive. Once he leaves, Juliet then discusses the situation with the friar, and she's so desperate that she threatens suicide. But instead, the friar suggests that she takes a potion that will make her appear dead, and he will send a message to Romeo asking him to return secretly and be with Juliet when she wakes, once her body has been taken to the family crypt. So this is that really, really ridiculous plan that the friar comes up with. In response to Juliet saying she's going to kill herself, the friar says this: "Hold, daughter, I do spy a kind of hope which craves as desperate an execution as that is desperate which we would prevent. If, rather than to marry County Paris, thou hast the strength of will to slay thyself, then it is likely thou wilt undertake a thing like death to chide away this shame, that copest with death himself to scape from it. And if thou darest, I'll give thee remedy." And you can see from the translation there that he's basically saying, well, if you've got the strength enough, the will enough to kill yourself to get out of this, perhaps you'll be willing to do something just as dangerous, just as desperate to avoid this shameful problem. To show that she is still desperate, Juliet says this: "Oh, bid me leap rather than marry Paris from off the battlements of yonder tower, or walk in thievish ways, or bid me lurk where serpents are, chain me with roaring bears, or shut me nightly in a charnel house, overcovered quite with dead man's rattling bones, with reeky shanks and yellow chapless skulls, or bid me go into a new-made grave and hide me with a dead man in his shroud." And you can see from that translation, she's basically just listing all the things she would rather do than marry Paris. Before we move on to the friar's plan, think about these three things. So firstly, why does Shakespeare use the word shame to describe Juliet's situation? Now you'll need to think back to the context of this play before you consider the answer to that. Secondly, what are the 6 things that Juliet says she would rather do than marry Paris? And then what do those show about her desperation? This is how the friar tells Juliet of his plan. He says, "Hold then, go home, be merry, give consent to marry Paris. Wednesday is tomorrow. Tomorrow night look that thou lie alone, let not the nurse lie with thee in thy chamber. Take thou this vial, being then in bed, and this distilled liquor drink thou off, when presently through all thy veins shall run a cold and drowsy humour, for no pulse shall keep his native progress, but surcease. No warmth, no breath shall testify thou livest. So we know, because of the ending of the play, that this is a ridiculous plan and that it doesn't go at all like he thinks. But at this moment, think about what are the pros and cons to the friar's plan. So think from Juliet's perspective, what are the pros and cons of this? The end of this scene is Juliet accepting the vial and promising to fulfill the plan. She says, give me, oh tell me not to fear. Hold, get you gone, be strong and prosperous in this resolve. I'll send a friar with speed to Mantua with my letters to thy lord. And Juliet ends the scene by saying, love give me strength, and strength shall help afford. Farewell, dear father. So she's saying there that the love she has for Romeo and the love they have for each other will give her the strength to do this, and that strength will make sure that this plan is seen through. But with that, think about what Shakespeare might be implying about love. Okay, is love that powerful? Is that romantic of Juliet to think that their love can kind of withstand everything and give her this strength, or is it naive? And then think about what we know about the end of the play. We know that despite their love, the plan isn't that strong, and no matter what happens, it ends in tragedy. So what does that do for that kind of statement from her at the end of this scene? So we've been thinking about Juliet's desperation in Act 4, Scene 1, but I want you to think about now how Shakespeare has presented that desperation. So it's been through the alternative she gives to marrying Paris. We've thought about that noun shame. We've thought about how desperate she is to avoid the situation because of her love for Romeo, and how that unending love for Romeo might be seen as desperate. Perhaps she's so desperate that she's naive. So think about one of those ideas and turn that into a what, how, why paragraph. If you need a reminder on how those might be constructed, look back at the previous week's PowerPoint. This is lesson 14 of the Romeo and Juliet lessons, and today it's all about how the characters react to Juliet's faked death. So we start with a quick quiz, and the answers are in the notes section of the PowerPoint. So remember, the friar is the one that's come up with this plan for Juliet to fake her own death. So let's think about the friar and if he really embodies the expectations of someone in his position in society. He's a religious man, you know, he's part of the Catholic Church. So we would expect him, and the audience would expect him to be honourable and honest, full of integrity, to be faithful and loyal, reliable and trustworthy and charitable. But think if he's really all those things. Would Romeo and Juliet think he's those things? Would their parents think he's those things? Okay, so Juliet has gone with this plan. She's taken the potion to make her appear dead, and in this scene, the nurse comes in to find her body. So in Juliet's bedroom, the nurse teases her about sleeping so heavily. So she comes in and starts saying, "Oh, why are you still asleep?" And teasing her about the night ahead with Paris. Until suddenly, the nurse realises that Juliet's stillness must mean something is wrong, and she calls out to say that Juliet is dead. Lord and Lady Capulet rush in and quickly fall into despair. The friar, Paris, and musicians enter the Capulet house, expecting the wedding, remember, but Lord Capulet explains that Juliet is dead. Each of the characters cries out in their pain and loss. And the scene ends with a quarrel between the servant and Peter and the musicians who have been hired for the wedding, which now becomes Juliet's funeral. Before we look at their reactions, let's remember the kind of last interactions we saw between some of these characters. So Lord Capulet, we know he's protective and loving, and at first he was very concerned about Juliet's age and her marrying so young. But in Act 3, Scene 5, he was very angry at her. He was threatening to disown her because she was disobeying him and she wasn't doing what he wanted her to do. And he said, "We have a curse in having her." The nurse has always been teasing Juliet throughout the play, but she wants her to marry Paris. She's very practical and forget about Romeo. But she does help to arrange the marriage between Juliet and Romeo and the meetings between them. So there is definitely that sense of closeness between them. So these are the first reactions from the nurse, Lady Capulet and Lord Capulet. The nurse says, "She's dead, deceased, she's dead, alack the day." Lady Capulet says right after, "Alack the day, she's dead, she's dead, she's dead." Lord Capulet says, "Ha, let me see her. Out, alas, she's cold, her blood is settled, and her joints are stiff. Life and these lips have long been separated. Death lies on her like an untimely frost upon the sweetest flower of all the field. O lamentable day, O woeful time! Death, that had taken her hence to make me well, ties up my tongue and will not let me speak." So there are a few things to note about these reactions. So first, you'll notice the use of repetition. So particularly in those first couple lines there from the nurse and Lady Capulet. Okay, they keep repeating that she's dead as if they were in disbelief that it's happening. Lord Capulet is much more eloquent and poetic with his language. He's able to come up with these quite detailed ways to describe how he's feeling. So for example, we've got that personification and that simile there. Death lies on her like an untimely frost. So Juliet's death is being associated with winter and cold, and it's come too soon. He then uses that metaphor that she's the sweetest flower of all the field. She's delicate and beautiful. Okay, quite different from how he was describing her earlier. We've got short sentences from the nurse and Lady Capulet. It's like they're in shock and can't think of anything else to say. "Oh lamentable day, oh woeful time." Okay, this is a really bad day. And then finally, again, that personification of death at the end from Lord Capulet. "Ties up my tongue and will not let me speak." So death is preventing him from speaking. So think about those reactions that we've just had a look at from the nurse, Lady Capulet and Lord Capulet, and have a go at answering these questions. Number 1, why does the nurse repeat that Juliet is dead? Number 2, what does this show about the nurse's feelings for Juliet? So think about their relationship. Number 3, look when Lady Capulet speaks. What do you notice about what she says? Number 4, what does this suggest about the relationship between Juliet and her mother? Number 5, how has Lord Capulet's feelings towards Juliet changed since Act 3, Scene 5, when he was angry with her? And number 6, do you think Lord Capulet's reaction is sincere? Do you believe him? Do you think he means it? Explain why you think that. It's the friar's reaction that's quite interesting. He says, "Peace, ho, for shame! Confusion's cure lives not in these confusions. Heaven and yourself had part in this fair maid, now heaven hath all, and all the better is it for the maid. Your part in her you could not keep from death, but heaven keeps his part in eternal life. The most you sought was her promotion, for 'twas your heaven she should be advanced, and weep you now, seeing she is advanced above the clouds as high as heaven itself? Oh, in this love you love your child so ill, that you run mad, seeing that she is well. She's not well married that lives married long, but she's best married that dies married young. Dry up your tears, and stick your rosemary on this fair corpse, and, as the custom is, in all her best array, bear her to church. For though fond nature bids us all lament, yet nature's tears are reason's merriment." So just look at that translation. Think about what he's really saying there. He's telling these parents that have just lost their child, from their perspective, that she's better off in heaven, that they should be happy that she's in heaven. And think about that line there where he basically says it is best to marry well and die young than to be married for a long time. So think about the ending of the play and think about what he's saying there. So there are 4 things to consider here. So Shakespeare has used dramatic irony. Okay, the audience know that Friar Lawrence knows that Juliet isn't dead. So although he's acting like she is, he knows full well that she isn't. So also think about how the Elizabethan audience would feel about this speech from the friar. Remember all those things that a friar is supposed to be. Is he exhibiting those characteristics in this speech? Also considering the time this was written, why do you think Shakespeare might be showing a member of the Catholic Church in this way? If he's not being particularly trustworthy, why might that be? And then think about the friar. Is he the reason for the demise of Romeo and Juliet? Is he foreshadowing their young death? Okay, they are married. Is it better for them, in his perspective, to marry well and die young? Lesson 15 is all about Romeo's reaction to Juliet's death and then the suicide of Romeo and Juliet. So start with a quick quiz, and as usual the answers in the notes section of this PowerPoint. So, believing that Juliet is dead, Lord and Lady Capulet have laid Juliet's body to rest at the church. And we know that the letter telling Romeo that she's not really dead does not reach him in time. Instead, his friend Balthazar arrives and tells Romeo that Juliet is dead. Romeo is distraught by this and he plans to kill himself by her side. So he heads back to Verona, buying a poison on the way. When he arrives at Juliet's tomb, he finds Paris there. Paris recognises Romeo and thinks he's there to do something villainous and vows to apprehend him or catch him. Paris also thinks that Romeo is the one that caused Juliet's death by killing Tybalt. Romeo begs Paris to leave him be, that he is a desperate man but does not want any more sin. The two of them end up fighting and Romeo kills Paris. He feels really guilty about it though. When Romeo does reach Juliet's body, he delivers this soliloquy. Now, a soliloquy is where a character gives their internal thoughts or feelings. So he says this: "For here lies Juliet, and her beauty makes this vault a feasting presence full of light. Death, lie thou there, by a dead man interred. How oft when men are at the point of death have they been merry, which their keepers call a lightning before death. Oh, how may I call this a lightning? O my love, my wife, death that has sucked the honey of thy breath hath had no power yet upon thy beauty. Thou art not conquered. Beauty's ensign yet is crimson in thy lips and in thy cheeks, and death's pale flag is not advanced there." He then catches sight of Tybalt, who is in the same crypt. "Tybalt, liest thou there in thy bloody sheet? Oh, what more favour can I do to thee than with that hand that cut thy youth in twain, to sunder his that was thine enemy? Forgive me, cousin." He turns back to Juliet. "Ah, dear Juliet, why art thou yet so fair? Shall I believe that unsubstantial death is amorous, and that the lean abhorred monster keeps thee here in dark to be his paramour? For fear of that, I will stay with thee, and never from this palace of dim night depart again. Here I will remain with worms that are thy chambermaids. Oh, here will I set up my everlasting rest, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. Eyes, look your last. Arms, take your last embrace. And lips, O you the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss, a dateless bargain to engrossing death. Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavoury guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rocks thy seasick, weary bark. Here's to my love. O true apothecary, thy drugs are quick. Thus with a kiss I die." Take some time now to read this translation of Romeo's soliloquy. Think about what he's saying about love and death. Okay, so I've picked out some of the key quotations from that big speech. What I'd like you to do is for each quotation, think about and write what Shakespeare is suggesting by that language. So I've given you the themes or motifs that that particular quotation is alluding to help guide your ideas, but also use the translation. At the moment of Romeo's death, the friar enters and he sees Paris and Romeo dead. Just at that moment, Juliet wakes. "O comfortable friar, where is my lord? I do remember well where I should be, and there I am. Where is my Romeo?" Friar Lawrence says this: "I hear some noise. Lady, come from that nest of death, contagion and unnatural sleep. A greater power than we can contradict hath thwarted our intents. Come, come, away. Thy husband in thy bosom there lies dead, and Paris too. Come, I'll dispose of thee among a sisterhood of holy nuns. Stay not to question, for the watch is coming. Come, go, good Juliet. I dare no longer stay." So I've given you the translation there, so think about what the friar is saying and who he's really worried about. Lesson 16 is all about the play's conclusion, so that final part of Act 5, Scene 3. So start with the quick quiz, and as usual, the answers are in the notes section of the PowerPoint. Okay, so really quick summary of the scene in its entirety. So Paris, mourning, visits Juliet's tomb. Romeo arrives and the two begin a fight or a duel outside, which ends in Paris's death. When Romeo enters the tomb, he sees Juliet in a corpse-like state. He believes she's dead and launches into this soliloquy, the long, sad speech. Then he kisses her and drinks the poison he's brought on his way there. Friar Lawrence enters just a moment too late and sees Romeo's corpse lying beside the not dead Juliet. As she wakes, Friar Lawrence attempts to convince her to flee or to run away, but she won't leave Romeo. She grabs the vial of poison, but there's none left. Instead, she reaches for his dagger and then stabs herself. She dies by Romeo's side. Not long after, the Prince, the Montagues, the Capulets, and several others arrive, horrified to see what has become of Romeo and Juliet. The friar then tells them the whole story, which is then backed up by Balthazar and others. The prince finally points out to the Montagues and the Capulets that this tragedy stemmed from their feud, from their arguments, and the two families agree to end their ancient grudge. Satisfied that this is the story, that what the friar has said is true, the prince calls forth the Capulets and the Montagues, and he basically tells them, do you see what a great evil results from your hate? Because of your fighting, because of your hatred, heaven has figured out a way to kill your joys with love. You've been punished by the gods almost. And he even says, because I looked the other way when your feud flared up, he let it continue. He's lost people as well. So he feels like everyone has been punished. So Lord Capulet and Montague agree to forgive each other, and they reconcile. And they agree to put up statues of Romeo and Juliet to remember them. And at the end there, Capulet identifies that Romeo and Juliet were poor sacrifices of the rivalry. So the prince delivers the final lines in the play. He says, a glooming peace this morning with it brings, the sun for sorrow will not show his head. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned and some punished, for never was there story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. So here the prince is saying, we settle a dark peace this morning. And he says the sun is too sad to show itself. Here there's too much darkness now in the world. He acknowledges that they will go and talk more about what's happened, and that some of them will be pardoned and forgiven, and some will be punished. And then those final two lines there was never a sadder story than of Romeo and Juliet. Okay, so 4 weeks ago I told you that Romeo and Juliet was about these things: love, hatred, death, conflict, old versus young, identity, gender, and revenge. So thinking about those themes, what I'd like to do is just write a sentence explaining how each of those themes are present in the play. So where do we see love? Where do we see hatred? Where do we see death? Once you've done that, rank order those themes. So which one do you think is the most present in the play, or the most important in the play? Which one's the least important? And then how do the others kind of fit in between? So in terms of the story and the main ideas, that's it. We're kind of there. So the final 2 weeks there'll be some time to catch up, and we'll look closer at some of those key moments and that key vocabulary. But for now, well done, Year 10.